Well, tonight, in 9 weeks' time, it's now widely assumed that campaigning for the election of 2010 will be over. But what then? Not so long ago, the opinion polls were predicting a Conservative victory. Now, who knows? And the closer the ratings of the parties in the opinion polls, the less the pound seems to be worth on the currency markets. On Monday, it dropped below $1.50 because, the argument goes, a hung parliament would be less decisive action to try to get the country out of the red. David Grossman reports.
After the expenses scandal, there are plenty of voters who might like to see MPs strung up. But a hung parliament is no joke. The financial markets had been expecting David Cameron to win this tug of war. Now, they're not so sure.
What the market's like is certainty, and this is a very uncertain period. Many political commentators actually make the point that a coalition government potentially could be good for the UK, but we have no history of it. We really don't know how long it would last if we get to a hung parliament stage. It's very likely that the markets are going to run out of patience and sterling will fall on the back of that.
Nick Clegg is normally squeezed in the middle and pushed behind the other party leaders. But for the Lib Dems, a hung parliament, well, that could be a huge opportunity. He could more or less name his price. But today, Mr Clegg made it clear he would not be putting party ambition above Britain's financial stability. But this is still a bit vague for the Lib Dems' former head of communications. Mark Littlewood now runs a think tank.
It's extremely difficult for the Liberal Democrats how to handle this issue. It really is. But I would think that the party should set out one or two or both of the following things. Either the key policies that they would demand if they were junior coalition partners, or at least the protocols and the rules that they would go through in order to decide whether to go into coalition. And it strikes me at the moment the party's done neither of those, and it really needs to do one or other or both.
In the current climate...
But Nick Clegg has a problem. His party's rules say that a formal coalition would need the support of 75% of his MPs and top party brass. Lots of highly polished brass on parade in London today. The Queen was welcoming the President of South Africa, Jacob Zuma. Her Majesty was, though, spared the sensitive decision of which of Mr Zuma's 3 wives to invite. He picked one to bring with him. And according to constitutional experts, the Queen must similarly not be expected to pick a PM. If there is a hung parliament, the Cabinet Secretary recently told MPs that it will be Gordon Brown's duty to stay in office until a stable government is formed, however long that takes.
I believe it is the responsibility of the Prime Minister to ensure that the monarch remains above politics, and that the Prime Minister, when the Prime Minister resigns, it is very apparent who the Queen should be calling to produce the next, hopefully stable government.
The civil service has done lots of work on preparing for a hung parliament. In an attempt to avoid controversy, the Cabinet Office has published the draft of a rule book which will determine what will happen. It includes a new constitutional principle that a Prime Minister in a hung parliament will not be allowed to take big decisions until a stable government has been formed.
The key new thing that we've learned is that the Cabinet Office now accept the new government should be subject to a caretaker convention. And that means that until it's clear in the new Parliament who can command confidence and form a new government, the old government remains in office, but it governs as a caretaker government.
And that means in practice what?
In practice, it means it can't take any big decisions that would tie the hands of a future government.
And this is what's worrying the markets. We might have a government that's politically and constitutionally unable to get a grip of the country's finances.
The main issue in the UK at the moment is the debt that the current government are carrying. The ratings agencies are very quick to downgrade a country's debt, and you need a strong government in power to put into austerity measures that will allow the government to reduce that debt. Now, with a hung parliament, there's a very issue that's just not going to happen. We could have 6 to 8 months of paralysis in UK politics. That's going to be very negative for the pound.
Since Britain last had a hung parliament in 1974, so much has changed. Not only do the markets move much faster, so does the media. But other countries still manage to give their politicians the time and space to decide what to do, something we perhaps will have to learn.
The UK is quite unusual, exceptional, in it normally only taking a day or so after the election before a new government is formed and sworn in. We're at a very extreme end of the spectrum, and if there is an uncertain election result, we've got to get used to and be patient while the political parties negotiate to find out who can form the new government.
And all the while, of course, the politicians will carry on pulling, desperate not to give ground. All of this is made more difficult by the fact that not one frontline politician or civil servant has any experience of trying to untangle a hung parliament.
Well, Paul Mason, our economics editor, is with us now to explore how the markets are reacting to the prospect of a hung parliament. I mean, is this the city effectively trying to dictate politics?
I think there is a large element of rationality in what the markets are trying to tell politicians here. We try and not cover one day's movements of sterling on this programme, and if you look at a graph here on a much larger scale for the last 2.5 years, there it is. You can see there is a seductive correlation between Labour's poll rating and the pound versus, in this case, the euro. But you could argue that the big thing that we're seeing is the one-off fall off a cliff aspect that happens after the Lehman Brothers collapse, right on the left-hand side of that graph, on that blue line. Now, I think in recent days, yes, you have seen markets reacting to it looking like a hung parliament, but there is a technical, or it's not technical, but a detailed reason why. You've got two parties both saying we want, three parties in fact, saying we want austerity and we want a credible path to a lower deficit. But when you look at beyond the 4-year plan that Alistair Darling has outlined, all we don't know about Alistair Darling's plan is where the cuts are going to come from. We know the balance of cuts and tax rises to fill the gap. When you look at the next 4 years, though, there's about 2% of GDP's worth of gap, of missing story. That's when people talk about a credibility gap. It's not decided whether it's tax rises or spending cuts that are going to fill that gap. These are decisions that will have to be taken pretty soon after the next election to get the public finances right over the long term. And what the markets fear is that with a hung parliament, you get the temptation for the politicians to take polarised positions as to whether we use a tax rising or a spending cut route to fill this gap. And of course, non-ideological political period though we might be in, one can guess which party would go for which. This is what they're worried about, that there's no credible plan emerges simply because the parties can't agree on tax or spend.
Paul, thanks very much indeed. Thank you.